everyone. Look at that. Well, we got applause. I can just go home and call it a night. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us for this session with former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Julián Castro. My name is Tanner Curl. I'm the Executive Director of MinnPost. Yes. We are a nonprofit independent newsroom serving Minnesota with in-depth coverage of civic and cultural life in our state. We're so glad to have you here in person this evening, and we're also glad to have our live stream audience joining us virtually. So thank you all for being here. I also want to thank our sponsors for the festival. That includes, and it's a long list, hold your applause to the end. It is the Minneapolis Foundation, the Shavlik Family Foundation, Accredited Investors Wealth Management, Darla Cashin at RBC Wealth Management, Holad Companies, Quincy Hall, the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation, UCare, At Sarah's Table, Chester Creek Cafe in Duluth, Baird Private Wealth Management, Frederickson and Byron, PA, the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and Knock Inc. Please join me in thanking all of our generous sponsors. I also want to thank Joel and Lori Kramer, our executive presenters for the festival. I figured we'd have some Kramer fans in the house. I also want to thank all of our VIP supporters, these generous individuals supporting us through the festival. You can see the full list at minnpost.com/festival. I also want to thank our over 5,500 MinnPost members, a group of people who support our work at all levels. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but spoiler alert, it involves minnpost.com/support. I also want to thank our live stream partners, Town Square TV, our ASL interpreters, as well as the team here at Quincy Hall. During this session, for you in the hall, you have some question cards on your table. You can submit questions. We'll be taking them later on. If you're joining us virtually, down at the bottom of your window is a Q&A button. Click that. You can submit your question virtually as well for Secretary Castro later in the session. But with that, I want to thank you all again for being here, and please join me in welcoming to the stage our featured guest, Julián Castro, and this session's moderator, MinnPost editor, Andy Putz.
Everybody, can everybody hear us? Okay. Here's a question you haven't heard for the last 2 years. Every time you've
take this off.
Okay, there you go. First of all, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. And we're excited to present our guest tonight. A long list of achievements, but I think we'll start with the headliners. Former HUD secretary, former mayor of San Antonio, current podcast host. Is there anything else we should add on there to your many list of achievements there? Secretary Castro?
That sums it up.
Okay.
Sums it up.
Good. I want to jump right into it, and I'll ask a question that, just to be fair, and strangely enough, we tend to ask almost every current and former office holder these days when they're interviewed by MinnPost. Who do you think won the 2020 presidential election?
I am 100% sure that Joe Biden actually won the 2020 presidential election. And so disappointed that folks on the other side of the aisle can't acknowledge the simple reality of that. Flabbergasted by it, actually.
Well, I do want to obviously tackle some serious issues. And one of those, frankly, is something that's been just in the news today, but in recent days, it seems like there are new revelations almost daily about the extent to which the Trump administration and its allies in Congress were invested in overturning the election. You obviously have experience in DC. Your brother is a member of Congress. I guess, just as an observer and obviously incredibly informed observer of DC politics, are you or have you been surprised by these revelations? Are you past being surprised by anything at this point?
I mean, I guess in some ways I shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised. But yeah, it was surprising to see in black and white these text messages that legislators who have said that they were not encouraging, the overturn of the election, denied even sending texts in some cases, or sending or communicating. And you see the evidence now that they actually not only communicated, but in fact called for things like martial law to be invoked and other ways that you could subvert the election. And what I mostly think is, number one, that's scary because the toppling of democracy doesn't happen oftentimes all at once. It happens because you get further and further astray from the norms and the principles and the values of a democracy. And then secondly, where in the world is the accountability for these people? Where is the accountability for this? My hope is that through the January 6th committee's work and through the work ultimately of the Justice Department, that these folks who deserve to be held accountable are going to be held accountable. Because if there is no accountability, then I believe that you're going to continue to see that anti-democratic movement in our politics.
You don't live in DC, you live in San Antonio still.
Mhm.
I know you travel around the country a lot, doing events like this, among other things. Do you feel like these things are resonating though with normal people who don't read the New York Times every day, or who aren't political junkies, or who aren't turned into MSNBC or Fox or any of that stuff? And that's most people, frankly.
No, I mean, I agree with you there. Most people do not watch MSNBC or Fox or CNN, for hours on end. But I do think that there are enough people that make a difference in elections. Because remember, the vast majority of people also don't vote in local elections, for instance, right? Oftentimes local election turnout is 15% or less. A lot of people don't vote in state elections. And only, just more than half of people vote in these big federal elections. So I feel like there are enough people that are active, that are paying attention, that I think that this can make a difference. It's only going to make a difference, though, if there's accountability. If there's no accountability, again, it sort of slips into this, well, I guess that wasn't so bad. There's no accountability here, so it couldn't have been that bad. That's sort of the big picture that I believe people will take away from it if there is ultimately no accountability. I don't know how much of a difference this is going to make in the November election. And I know we're going to probably talk a little bit about that. Everybody is getting nervous. A lot of folks are getting nervous about what's going to happen in November. I don't know that it's going to matter in November, but I do think that it's going to matter ultimately in the years to come about the direction our democracy takes. And even in some electoral races, what happens in those races.
Well, since you brought it up, let's talk a little bit about that. This is something I know you recently talked about on your podcast. President Biden's approval rating right now is 41% approve, 54% disapproval, which is almost exactly where Trump was at this stage in his presidency. Again, why do you think Biden is so unpopular?
And I think that there are a number of reasons for that. Number one, everybody remembers when Mitch McConnell said that he was going to do everything he could to try and make Obama a one-term president. Well, that hasn't ended. They're still trying to do what they can to stop Biden from being successful at every turn. And so he's facing this headwind of a Republican Party that is, on most things, there are some exceptions like the infrastructure bill, which to their credit and to Biden's credit, they got passed. But on most things, you have an obstructionist party on the other side. And the administration has gotten some fantastic things done. The infrastructure investment, the CARES Act, what they've done with COVID compared to the previous administration in terms of getting shots into people's arms. The unemployment rate is 3.6% right now. We've had the fastest recovery from a recession in American history. All of that, you would think that in the polling that Biden would be doing better, right? I think one of the reasons that he's maybe not doing as well is because as Democrats, we're often not as good at touting our accomplishments, touting what has been accomplished. I remember sitting in a cabinet meeting where President Obama, and this was in late 2014 or early 2015, President Obama was talking about comparing the messaging and how effective it was in the campaign in 2008 and 2012, and the image and basically the sale that was created for that to where we were in the administration, and saying, that we had a product like Coke or Apple that people knew and they liked, and now what's going on with the messaging here? Well, in a real way, I think that Biden has the same challenge, that these accomplishments of the administration have not been, I think, sold well enough, and they're substantive accomplishments, but I don't know that Americans have given the administration credit for it. This is compared to Trump, who tried to take credit for things he had nothing to do with and exaggerated his accomplishments at every turn, right? So that's number one. Secondly, as much as the administration has accomplished, I do feel like there were instances where, especially for young people, for example, that they overpromised and have underdelivered during this time. Canceling student loan debt, for instance. Biden said that he would cancel $10,000 of student loan debt, right? I was telling somebody earlier, some of y'all may have seen that he had a meeting, I think earlier today or yesterday, with the Hispanic caucus, and I caught a blurb of it, and he told them that it was his intention to either cancel all or almost all of student loan debt for Americans. And that was the first time that I've seen anything like that from him. Maybe, they're gonna take a more aggressive path on things like that. I also think for some of the base constituencies of the party, voting rights, for example, right? That's been a huge issue for a lot of folks, and obviously very meaningful for all Americans to preserve our democracy, but especially in the African-American community, the Hispanic community, in these places like my home state of Texas, where it's totally under assault. And hey, you can't, at some level, if Joe Manchin is not going to support what you're doing, you're kind of stuck, right? But I think the challenge for Biden is that he presented himself as the candidate who, because of his years of experience in the Senate, could bring those sides together and make these deals. And so part of those numbers, I believe, reflect a disillusionment with some of these base constituencies and with progressives about, well, why hasn't voting rights happened? Why hasn't immigration reform happened? Why didn't meaningful police reform like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, that I think most folks would agree was not defund the police. It was not some, far left-wing thing. It was substantive policy solutions. That didn't go anywhere in the Senate. There's some disillusionment at that.
I'm gonna put you into a corner here. What grade would you give Biden and Congress?
What's that?
What grade would you give Biden?
What grade would I give Biden?
Yeah. How would you grade him? And Congress. You can do both.
I always so reluctant to play that game of grades for people because I think
this is
it's
why
more
I'm asking
nuanced than that. I mean, I think that he is under the circumstances making a huge positive difference for the things that Americans need the most right now: more economic opportunity, on issues of public health and combating COVID, on investing in infrastructure. And so I believe that he's done a lot with the problems that were presented to him as a president, especially in a polarized America.
I know you're going to probably get plenty of questions from the audience about national politics. So I'm going to turn it back just a little bit about your home state. You mentioned, I think a lot of people, and I'm sure you get asked this all the time, there is this expectation among Democrats that Texas is always sort of when is it going to become a real battleground state, right? When is it going to become truly competitive? What is your answer when you are asked that? When do you think that Texas will be a place that is truly contested by will be essentially fought over by Democrats and Republicans?
It's getting there. We have some Texans here, I think, like raise your hand if you're from Texas. We have some displaced Texans who apparently have gotten used to acclimated to the weather in Minnesota. Here's the thing. Texas is moving in that direction. In 2012, Obama loses to Romney by 16 points in Texas. In 2016, Hillary loses by 9 points. And in 2020, Biden loses by 5.5 points. And in between, in the midterm year of 2018, Democrats won 2 congressional seats, one in the suburbs of Houston and one in the suburbs of Dallas, Lizzie Fletcher and Colin Allred, and 2 state Senate seats. There are 31 state Senate seats in our legislature, and they won 12 state House seats and came basically within 9 seats of the majority. So fairly close for Texas. People wouldn't think that, but got pretty close. And then in 2020, it was a wash. It was basically just held flat. So the gains of 18 were preserved and mostly preserved in 2020. It's just such a huge state. It's a huge state without some of the ingredients that propel states, I think, to turn over. It's still a very anti-union state, if you take it all together, right? Although there's a lot of organizing going on down in Austin and San Antonio and a couple of other places with Starbucks workers that are getting organized, for instance. It's still a rural state in a lot of places. And, we know that rural communities in the Trump era have tended to move more red. I think y'all have seen that in some places here in Minnesota. And so it's going to take some time. I think that Beto in 2022 has a chance of beating Greg Abbott because Greg Abbott has messed up so much on the job. Like he's shown a lot of incompetence and apart from ideology even just has been bad at his job. On that winter storm where 700 people died, on this trucking issue a couple of weeks ago of the trucks being stalled and produce going to waste and businesses losing dollars. So there's a chance that Beto can win, but I think it's still a work in progress.
You've obviously been mentioned quite a few times when people talk about running for statewide office in Texas. Is that still a possibility for you at some point in the future? Whether for Senate, whether for the governorship? I mean, is that something you think about?
Yeah, I mean, I may jump back into politics at some point. I didn't want to run until people asked about 2022, and I felt like I had just run this marathon in the 2020 election and was not up for running right away again. But I'll make a decision at some point about whether I jump back in the next cycle, the cycle after that. You know what's weird? And I know that there's some folks, I know Mayor Ryback is here, I saw him, who, when I came to visit Minneapolis for the first time, I was mayor of San Antonio and was such a great host. I spoke at an Achieve Minneapolis event. I have never missed being in office when I'm out of office. I mean, not that I love it and I think about policy and I like it. And sometimes when I think, when I see Beto out there these days, I think, oh, wow, wouldn't that be fun to be out there campaigning and if you actually want to get the chance to make a difference in people's lives and get us away from all of this stuff these guys are doing. But I don't feel on a daily basis like, I have to be in there. I just wish I was, I don't know. I didn't miss it when I lost my first mayor's race in 2005. I didn't miss it after I left HUD and I'm not missing it now.
One of the things that was a lot of people noted coming out of the 2020 election in Texas was, you saw Trump make gains, particularly in these rural counties among Black and Latino voters. How concerning is that for you as a Democrat and as a person who obviously knows Texas and understands the politics there? What did you make of those results and what it potentially means for Democrats.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of people, you scratch your head. Well, how could these Hispanic voters vote for Trump in greater numbers after everything that he stood for and how bad he was on so many issues, not only immigration, but also just bread and butter issues, healthcare, education, any number of issues, equal opportunity. And I think part of it was this urban-rural split that no matter who you were in some of these parts of the country, like that was seemed to be a strong factor. I also think that in some of those areas in South Texas, the Republicans invested a lot of time and energy trying to register voters and to turn out their less frequent voters. And the Texas Democratic Party did an autopsy of the 2020 election to try and figure out, hey, what happened here in these counties? And what they determined was that Republicans at the end of the campaign cycle out-registered voters versus Democrats. I think to the tune of like 90,000 voters down there. And they did a better job at turning out infrequent voters. They're infrequent voters, people who had voted Republican, who were Hispanic, who had voted Republican in the past, but didn't show up most of the time. And we were not as good at turning those same folks out who had voted Democrat in the past, but didn't show up all the time, those less consistent voters. So that's a good lesson learned going forward. I mean, you know, we want to be constructive about, okay, well, what are we going to do with that? What the Democratic Party in Texas is doing is they're spending more on voter registration and they're spending more on voter mobilization of not only consistent voters, but inconsistent voters. So I think this time in 2022, at least they see that coming and they have a game plan to address it. And the other part of that is we need to recruit great candidates in those areas too, and can't take those areas for granted because for forever, people just voted Democratic down there. I imagine it's like sometimes people take Minnesota for granted because for forever it was just a Democratic state, right? Or at least parts of Minnesota. And y'all have seen in certain areas during this Trump era that it's migrated toward Republicans. Well, you know, we're dealing with some of that in Texas and particularly among Latinos in South Texas. The flip side of that people don't talk as much about as explicitly is that white suburbanites in Houston and Dallas and Austin and San Antonio, you know, many of them moved in the other direction. I mean, if you think about it, like how do you get from Trump winning by 9 points in 2016 to him only winning by 5.5 in 2020, right? The sky didn't fall then because really you still made progress. And a lot of that progress was in suburban communities. And, you know, if we broke down the racial and ethnic component of that, that would include a lot of Anglo-Texans that decided like this, you know, the Republican Party doesn't represent me anymore. And they flipped. And I think we also need to do a better job as Democrats of understanding that and of fostering that in a positive way and forging a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition better in Texas and in other parts of the country and recruiting candidates who can do that well and speak to different folks in ways that'll forge that partnership and coalition.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a different part of the same theme, but you've mentioned this before. I mean, and the same thing is definitely happening in Minnesota, where you're seeing not just the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, but the suburbs became increasingly Democratic, essentially, and the most of greater Minnesota, outside the metro area, with some exceptions, really moved towards Republicans, even in places that were once considered Democratic strongholds. Obviously, the Iron Range would be the most well-known example of that. Again, how concerned should Democrats be about that movement? Can they really, even if they are making gains in the suburbs, can they really afford to essentially not worry and write off people who just live in small towns and rural parts of America? Because this seems like it's happening in Texas, it's happened in Minnesota, it's happening all over the country. What is how do Democrats confront that, and what are the, how concerned should they be?
Well, I mean, of course, we should be concerned as Democrats, and you have to compete everywhere. You can't give up on anybody because they live in a certain part of the state or a certain part of town. I'm one who believes, and during the presidential campaign, I pledged to visit all 50 states. Now, hey, I only got to 30 because I didn't make it all the way through. But I do think that we have to make the case everywhere. And we have a case to make everywhere. I mean, y'all have probably seen this in Minnesota, right? One of the big stories in rural America over the last 2 decades is how many public hospitals and other public institutions have closed. And this attack that Republicans have launched on our public schools in many ways hits rural communities the most because they don't have a ton of private schools or options for their kids the way that a lot of big cities do. And so when you sap them of resources or you skew the learning there and all of that, I mean, that affects their local public school intimately. We have a case to make. We need to make it in every way, in investing the resources to register voters there, to mobilize them, to run candidates. One of the things I was very proud of in the 2018 and 2020 cycles was that in Texas, for the first time in a long time, we had a Democrat running in every congressional district. I think in every House district, state House district, every state Senate district. That makes a difference. That reverse coattail effect, it makes a difference. And we need to keep doing that, including in rural areas. And I think with the infrastructure package, Biden has a lot to sell because that's going to be, in a meaningful way, a positive force in rural communities. And he has to sell it. What we have going against us is that Republicans for forever have used these culture war issues effectively, have distracted and have polarized and have divided very, very well. And I don't know that Democrats have ever been that great at trying to combat that.
Well, I want to be conscientious of time, and I know we're at a point where they want to collect questions, both from in-person people and to people who are watching us on the live stream, that you can submit your question via the Q&A function. So I want people to do that now. So we'll collect those and then we'll start to answer those questions. So I think that's going to start to happen here, and then we're going to give you a spiel for money, and then we're going to ask your questions. But I wanted to ask you, while you brought that up, obviously there was just recently that legislator in Michigan who really had a very forceful response around sort of that, the culture wars issue, if you will. And there does seem like there has been some debate within Democratic circles about how to respond to some of these issues around, culture. And I'm curious to know what you thought of her speech and whether you think that, essentially taking on some of those issues in a more forceful and frankly, so taking them head on, if you will, is a better way to go than at least how Democrats have, at least recently, chosen to kind of address that stuff, which is often to ignore it or to say this isn't really a big deal, or kind of pretend it's not really happening.
I'm a fan of her speech. I think it's State Senator, was it Mallory? Was it McMorrow?
McMorrow, right.
I thought she just did a fantastic job articulating the values that we hold and pushing back against the divisiveness of Republicans. I think we're at a point where you have to address it head on. It's not going away. I believe that these days in politics, you can't get very far if people think that you're backpedaling or that you're scared of an issue. What people are responding to with Trump also is this sense of strength. Now, it's misplaced strength, right? It's strength for the wrong reason, but it's a sense of resoluteness. And I think the Democrats need to be willing to show that and push back on whether it's this ridiculous CRT issue or these transphobic attacks on transgender community. I don't think, or even this stuff with Title 42 and immigration, which probably for a lot of people is a harder one, because I think folks have been so conditioned to think that you just can't get over that issue and just stay away from it. And it's like a third rail issue. I don't think that ultimately you're going to win as a party by trying to avoid it. You have to address it. And I think you have to make an appeal directly to values that we ought to hold, that we ought to aspire to as Americans. If we don't, then if we just leave it be and ignore it, then they fill that void with the hate, with the division, and it's easier for people to follow them down that path. And that's what's happening with too many people.
I want to shift back just a little bit to your experience as a candidate, frankly. You have, I think, something of a relatively impressive resume. You went to Stanford, you went to Harvard Law School, you were elected to the San Antonio City Council at age 26, right? But you also lost your first mayoral, your bid to be mayor of San Antonio. And you obviously, ran in a presidential campaign that I'm assuming didn't go according to plan. What are the things that you learned from those experiences? What are the things that you carry with you in terms of, the things that, are most memorable about, again, the things where, all didn't go according to plan?
Well, I mean, I think it's true what they say that that you learn, and I was telling you this before we started, I think it's true that you learn more from losing, from defeat, than you do from winning. Because oftentimes when you win, hey, it's on to celebrate and it's all great, right? And you kind of can paper over what you could have done differently or better, or the mistakes that you made even when you won. And when you lose, at least I found, I was 30 and I lost my first mayor's race. I was trying to become the youngest mayor in San Antonio history, and I was running against a guy that was 70, trying to become the second oldest mayor. And he turned out to be a great mayor, very good mayor. But he won in a close runoff in 2005. And, it made me think about what we could have done better in the campaign and how I could have forged a broader coalition of supporters. And because if you have a sense of pride, you want to think about that and, okay, well, what should I have done better? And then, I came back 4 years later because we had some of the strictest term limits in the country. You could only serve two two-year terms. They also only paid $20 per meeting for city council members at that time. A few years later, after I left as mayor, they changed it to actually give a salary to their council members and mayor. But at that time, it was this messed up system. I came back 4 years later and won that. From the presidential race, I learned that it's invaluable to already have huge name ID. If you notice, almost everybody, except a very few candidates, have established name ID, right, that win those races. My number one lesson was that the person that prevails in those races is the person that really meets the moment. And the moment that we were in as we headed into November 2020 was definitely for Democrats, and I think even for independents, which the election bore out, was people had had enough of this childish, mean, inexperienced, incompetent president, and they wanted an adult in the room. They wanted somebody that they knew was experienced and they had confidence in, knew their way around and was going to be a steady hand. And that was Joe Biden. Out of everybody, I mean, he most fit that moment. They also wanted somebody from an electoral standpoint that they thought could go toe-to-toe with Trump in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin. Here in Minnesota, that was very close in 2016, right? That was closer than people thought. And some people were saying going into 2020 that Minnesota would be the next state to flip over.
Mostly Trump, by the way. He kept saying that.
Yeah. So I think Biden, both in his experience and what he brought to the table, and then also what he brought to the political map, met the moment the most. And for me, it was quite an experience. And like I'm sure all the candidates would say, I learned a lot and got to meet people and hear ideas and learn about the country in a way that I never would have learned about it if I had not run for president, it was really neat and definitely worth doing, even though, I didn't get anywhere close to winning the election. I hope you all are clapping for the idea of it instead of me not getting close to winning the election.
I was going to ask, and I asked you this before, but what is the part of running for president that sort of surprised you the most or was different than you thought it was going to be?
I think a couple of things. Being in Iowa, it was really like you're in a movie about running for president because it really does live up to like you're in somebody's house having these house parties, making your pitch, and the same people that are hosting you have hosted like 7 other candidates, and I say that affectionately in the sense like the thing that although y'all probably know that I called for the primary calendar to be changed, for Iowa not to go first and so forth. But the thing that I really did give them credit for and enjoyed was that people really follow their politics there. They get into it to their credit. Most times, how many of us have been frustrated by, they don't vote or they don't follow the news, or like people take it seriously. So it was almost like, it was surprising how much it seemed like a movie at times. Like you're in the movie about running for president, because that's what it is. The other thing that I don't know if I would say it surprised me, but what I picked up on was that people really wanted solutions. Whether people were liberal or they were moderate, they wanted solutions. People would perk up the most when you actually started talking about how you would solve a problem. Right? And I found that neat because, and I imagine Mayor Rybak would agree, when you're a mayor, that's a lot of what you deal with, like solving actual problems. Because you can't shirk your responsibility. People know whether you fixed a problem or not, because it's right in front of them. And so local government is very based on that. And so I started to lean into that a little bit more as I recognized that, and as we did more and more of these town halls and the house parties in New Hampshire and Iowa, and that gave me hope too. It gave me hope that even though everything gets pitched as an ideological battle, that in people's hearts and minds at some level, they still, like, what are you going to do? I'll listen to you, but how are you going to fix this? I want to know how you're going to fix it. As long as people have in their heart and in their mind that instinct, I think that there is hope, for our democracy.
Okay, this is where we're going to take a break, and Tanner is going to come up and talk, and we're going to curate some questions and have you answer some audience questions here after we do this very short and very compelling pitch from Tanner.
I think this is what Andy referred to as the money spiel. But yeah, please join me in thanking Andy and Secretary Castro. We'll get back to their conversation and your questions very soon, I promise. Earlier, I thanked a number of people, a number of organizations, but there's a very important group of people who I want to thank and recognize. So would all of the MinnPost staff in the room please stand up? And that includes contributing writers, freelancers, please stand up. There's a number of staff at home. You can stand up at home too. This group of people, this talented group of people, they're at the heart of MinnPost. Whether writing or editing stories, making sure the website is running, making sure everything looks good, we've got photos, making sure we have the resources, making sure our bills are paid, the rent is paid. These people make MinnPost, and again, please join me in thanking them for their incredible work. And now, of course, you can do more than just applaud them. You can support them in what they do. Now, many of you here and joining us on the live stream are already supporters, whether it's as festival VIPs, as sponsors, as MinnPost members. But if you've never donated to MinnPost before, or maybe you feel so moved to make a special gift in a big election year, You can be a crucial part of our work. You are a crucial part of our journalism by making a donation at minnpost.com/support. I believe conveniently, we've put the website right here on this sign. If you want, you can take out your phone right now. Don't be shy. It's not rude. minnpost.com/support. Any amount makes a difference. A full 2/3 of our funding every year come from individual donors. And this support not only allows us to produce in-depth journalism about Minnesota, but, and this is important, it allows us to make that reporting available to all readers for free. We have no paywall, and that's only possible, yes. That's only possible thanks to the philanthropic support we receive from donors, from funders. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for being a part of this. I'll say it again, minnpost.com/support. And with that, I will hand it back to Andy and Secretary Castro. Thank you all.
All right, let's get right to it. Audience questions, here we go. What has changed about the Democratic Party since you were elected to the city council?
What has changed about the Democratic Party? Well, I think the Democratic Party, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, for one thing, is more vocal now and has had more success. Folks will recall that, when we went through the Reagan era in the 80s, and then especially in the 90s, and the election of Bill Clinton in 92, we went through this period where Democrats were overwhelmingly convinced that this third way was the way to win elections, sort of moderate, centrist approach. And there's no question that you still have a lot of, centrist moderates who are elected in office and effective and so forth. But I do think that the last few years has seen the rise of the progressive voice again in the Democratic Party. And I think that you always need a healthy balance of that, because I like the progressive voice challenging the establishment of the Democratic Party to think creatively, to push back on Republican mendacity and push back on this idea that smaller government is also always better government, or the idea that government never has any role to play in bettering people's lives, and remind us of the values that we have. I said this when I was testifying as HUD secretary to the Financial Oversight Committee or Financial Services Committee that I had to testify. It doesn't matter how liberal you are or how conservative you are, though. At the end of the day, you have to make things work. You have to make things operate well, function well. And so, I consider myself a progressive. I also want to make sure, this is the former mayor in me, that things work, right? That they work out, the policy works. And I think that you can do both of those things. That's one thing that I think has changed about the Democratic Party. It's also the only sane major party these days, because I think the other interesting question is what's changed about the Republican Party. Yeah. And the Republican Party, in my mind, and I don't mean every single Republican, but the party has gone off the rails. I mean, and Republicans themselves have said this, and they say it in private. It's unrecognizable compared to where it was 30 years ago, or even 15 years ago. I never would have imagined that our former governor, Rick Perry, would be sending these text messages basically about subverting the election. That party, as it stands now under Trumpism, represents a threat, a long-term threat to the democracy of our country. And so I hope that they're able to pull themselves out of that ditch and able to offer an ideological contrast to Democrats and another way of looking at ideas and policy, but to do so in a fundamentally democratic, pro-democratic, small d way.
Another audience question. Black people, women in particular, elected Joe Biden. but what specifically has he done to reward their support and to garner it again in 2014?
Well, I mean, I think that there are a number of things that the Biden administration has done. I mean, a good example of that are appointments. The appointments that President Biden has made, both of women overall and then of African-American women and of Black Americans overall, has exceeded all of the other presidents so far. And we had a great example of that with Ketanji Brown Jackson, who just became a Supreme Court justice. But just as importantly, I think, in terms of policy, the investments that the administration has pushed for, whether the CARES Act or, I mean, the rescue plan or any number of other items, policy-wise and spending-wise, are making investments in communities that too often get overlooked. Having said all that, I think maybe perhaps that underneath the question, there's, you know, a pointing out of where we still need, the administration still needs to do some work. I think police reform is one of those places. Voting rights is definitely one of those places. If I were in the administration, I would be saying max out your executive authority in every single way that you can, in every way that you can. If you really can't get 50 votes because Manchin is in the way, or Sinema is in the way, or whoever else, then max out your executive authority on these things. And that means that in an appropriate way, the Justice Department has to be as aggressive a partner as possible in protecting voting rights through the enforcement of what's left of the Voting Rights Act and other laws that might be able to protect the rights of people of color in this country. I think that this represents the biggest danger to success in November. I don't think the biggest danger to success for Democrats in November is that people see Joe Biden as too far to the left, although some people may. It's that parts of the coalition that are absolutely crucial are not enthused enough. And because of that, your numbers are going to be way too low in terms of turnout. And in these close congressional districts where everything is so polarized, that's not going to serve Democrats well. And I believe that the administration, like Biden's comments on student loan debt, on a couple of other things more recently, I think they're shifting gears to recognize that instead of just catering to this middle, that they need to enthuse the base. I call people's attention back to the summer of 2012 when Obama did DACA. DACA was very interestingly timed. I mean, obviously I agree with DACA and I'm glad that President Obama was, I think, smart and courageous to do it. It was also interesting timing, right? A couple of months before the election. Hopefully Joe Biden will take a page out of some of what President Obama did, and I think both in a positive way for the policy, substantively, to help people that need it, and then also politically in a savvy way to boost up the enthusiasm going into November, or else what we're going to be facing is Republicans controlling the House of Representatives with Speaker Kevin McCarthy and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell again. I mean, can you imagine that?
This sort of gets to what you've been talking about here just recently, but is there a strategy of Democrats putting forth more centrist or moderate candidates to pull independents and unhappy Republican voters to the Democratic side? In other words, are more leftist candidates turning off potential voters?
Oh, look, I mean, I acknowledge that not every district is Brooklyn, right? I live in Texas, you know, and also I ran in a nonpartisan system. When I ran for mayor, we didn't run with party labels, and so had the opportunity to speak to people that didn't agree with me when we would go canvassing, block walking, like we would go knock on the doors of Republicans because we didn't have party labels. I can't remember a single time on the dais all of those years where we addressed things with and said Republican or Democrat in discussing an issue. So there was this sense that you were kind of working apart from that system. And so do I think that there are instances where some of these progressive ideas can turn voters off, some voters off? Yeah, of course. I also think that there are instances where, a lot of instances where these super conservative policies turn voters off. And there are instances where centrist policies don't enthuse the base of the party enough to get them out to vote. And so you need to be able to navigate that well. Right? I don't think it's a static approach. I don't think it's one answer. If we had 100% centrist Democrats tomorrow, that would not mean that the Democratic Party would suddenly be more successful than it is now, right? And I don't think that if we had 100% progressive Democrats, that would be true either. There are differences, but I think that oftentimes, too many of the Democrats start to cower at some of the progressive ideas because they automatically think that they're not going to fly, that they're not going to go over. And that actually, if you stand up for the idea and the principle that you can sell them effectively to more voters than you think, think about what Republicans have done. Think about how far off the rails they've gone on January 6th, how far off the rails Trump went on any number of things, the attacks on the transgender community, the attacks on the right to choose. They have never been squeamish about going all the way out there to the right. And yet the polling says that, in the generic ballot heading into November, that they're, 7 or 8 points ahead of Democrats. They're having their best year for polling that they've had in many, many cycles. Right? We cannot be shy about the values that we say we hold. You can't be shy about that. Sometimes you have to connect with people, perhaps with different language or in a different way, and you have to make sure that what you're saying actually can work. You can operationalize it, but we can't be shy about our values and standing up for people, especially the most vulnerable people. So.
How will Democrats handle Biden's age in 2024?
What was the question?
How will Democrats handle Biden's age in 2024?
Well, I don't think it's about Democrats handling his age. I think that, well, first of all, I think he's doing great. He's doing just fine. But for any candidate, it's about how the candidate handles himself or herself, right? Y'all remember the '84 race with Reagan after that first debate with Mondale and all the questions that arose. And then Reagan came back the next debate and he whipped off that joke, about not making an issue of Senator Mondale, or Vice President Mondale, Senator Mondale's age as being young. I think Joe Biden is doing great, and that if he decides to run for re-election, obviously he's going to be the leading contender. I don't know that anybody would challenge him in 2024, and I believe that he would have a good chance, given what the options are on the Republican side, whether it's Trump again, or it's a Trump clone like Ron DeSantis, or Greg Abbott in my home state. I think that Joe Biden would be able to prevail against those candidates.
Texas has become a battleground for trans rights, and Republicans are making this a national fight. How can Democrats take this head on, and what successes are you seeing in this to fight Governor Abbott on this?
I do think that it's a fight that we need to push back. We need to take head on, that we need to push back on. Texas, Florida, a number of other places. Like, y'all remember a couple of years ago when they had these bathroom bills in Texas and different parts of the legislature. It was basically a scare tactic about, I have a 13-year-old daughter. They're saying basically your daughter is going to use the restroom and some man is going to go in there and, assault them and so forth. It was a scare tactic that they used to try and drum up fear ahead of that election cycle. And they're doing it again. It's the same blueprint that they use every time. They pick a vulnerable community, whether it's immigrants or it's Black Americans or other people of color or our women or the LGBTQ community, in this case, the transgender community. Pick a vulnerable community whose issue can divide people, polarize them, and then just zero in on that. And the whole point of it is not even, you know, the policy, it's that they know that that will polarize people. And they think they can gain an advantage in doing that. That's what they're doing. They've chosen to do in this cycle with the transgender community. And that's what I'm saying, that when we're Democrats, that we need to coalesce every time and forcefully, all parts of the coalition, push back on that. And do it loudly, and do it proudly, and do it resolutely, right? Every time. And if you do that, that is infectious. You convince, you affect more people than you think going into it, right? If you don't, then people that don't really follow politics all the time, they said, yeah, you know, I guess that could be the case. Like, you know, and these guys seem to be the only ones that, like, really, you feel like they are resolute and they're standing behind their argument, and Democrats are backpedaling from that. I think one of the things that we've learned in Texas with the bathroom bill and other pieces of legislation like that is that forging an alliance together as a coalition, and also with the business community, in Florida, this whole don't say gay law and the way that Disney, after initially equivocating, stepped up and pushed back, and they're punishing them for that. But still, I think that that's a blueprint, getting those coalitions together that include the business community when you can get them, and pushing back as hard as possible, and calling it out for what it is, homophobia or racism or whatever it is, and not letting them get away with it. In the long run, there's no other way that you're going to win that argument. You know, you're not going to win the argument by sidestepping it. You're not going to win the argument by watering down your response to it. I think you're only going to win it by being bold back at people. You don't have to be ugly in how you respond to it. You don't have to try and alienate people, but you have to be resolute in doing it.
We need to wrap up, but I did want to ask you one more question. And, you know, we do these events every year, and at least for the last few years, we have mostly left people walking out of the room incredibly depressed about the state of the country, democracy, et cetera. And so I wanted to try not to do that tonight. So I guess my question to you is, you know, you travel around the country a lot. I know you do a lot of stuff. You've got a lot going on. What do you see out there that gives you hope?
I see a lot of people engaged. Even if they're frustrated sometimes, people are engaged. Even if it's that they're talking about the gas prices being high, right? Which a lot of people are talking about. They're engaged. You would rather have people engaged and paying attention than disengaged in these times. If people are engaged and paying attention, we have a chance. Our democracy has a chance. And because you need at least a kernel of concern from people to succeed in a democracy. That gives me a lot of hope. The other thing, I'll give you a little anecdote. I was in Boise, Idaho, at the beginning of March. I think it was like March 12th or something. I spoke at their annual dinner, the Democrats' annual dinner. And earlier that day, I'd walked over to the state capitol. And in the state capitol, there was a group of teenagers that were there for a quinceañera, which some of y'all may know is like the 15, when a girl in a lot of Latino cultures, they turn 15, they have this quinceañera. It's like a sweet 16, a debut. And they were taking a picture there with the court, the quinceañera court in Boise, Idaho. And it reminded me about the beauty of the country, and that our beauty is in that we're a country that, with all of our faults and, you know, all of the high writing and rhetoric of the founding of the country that hasn't always been matched, but still that in so many ways we've made beautiful progress in the country. And what I saw in those kids was the future, right? like a future that could be a place that's welcoming of people who think differently and look differently and act differently. That gave me hope. And so I like to think about that these days when I'm starting to feel down watching cable news.
All right, well, that is what we have for tonight. So I want to thank Secretary Castro for being
Thank y'all
here.
very much. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. We also want to thank our VIP supporters and sponsors, and thanks everyone who has donated tonight. Each of you out there still can join this generous group of people and support MinnPost at minnpost.com/support. I will say that again because that's how important that is. minnpost.com/support. Thank you to our in-person audience, and thanks to everyone tuning in on the live stream. The festival, the MinnPost Festival, of which this is a big part, is back tomorrow at noon with a virtual session featuring Margaret Sullivan, media columnist for the Washington Post, to discuss the crisis facing local news. Please join us then and have a great